Last week we ended the sermon with a request, a question, and a request. The question that I asked is, how willing are we to enter into the riskiness of coming close to our Lord and having Him come close to us? I don't know if you remember or not, but we talked about the man who was born blind and how, without him asking, in his passing, Jesus noticed him and initiated his healing. He initiated his healing to one who was considered unclean, one who was considered a sinful man or the son of sinful parents, one who was off limits to his community because he was born blind. And yet Jesus entered into his midst. He didn't enter in and call him to be a better man. He didn't enter in to call him to repent of his evil ways. He didn't enter in to reprimand his parents. He didn't enter in to bash or belittle. He entered in to call him into a new way of experiencing the blessings of God by touching him and inviting him to see like he had never seen before. And so today I have a question for you, just like I had at the end of the sermon last week. You see, Jesus can heal from afar. You remember the story of the centurion, right? Speaking of off limits, speaking of unclean, speaking of outside and have nothing to do with, if you will. But that centurion, that man on the outside, looked on the inside and believed enough to say, Lord, you don't have to come. Just say the word. Just speak the word, and your authority is powerful enough to act across the miles, across the distance, across the barriers. Your word of authority is enough. And he firmly believed it. So we don't have to be up close and personal. But it's good to be up close and personal. It's risky, but it's good. And so I wonder how much you're willing to risk today. I wonder how much of those things in your heart and mind that you would prefer not to be known. You'd prefer to kind of keep in the shadow, if you will, so that it's not brought into the light and everybody can see. I wonder how much of that you'd be willing to bring with you into his presence, knowing that no one else has the power to heal, the power to forgive, the power to redeem and transform and bring new life like it's never been before in your life. I wonder how willing you are to risk the misunderstanding of those around you. I wonder how willing to risk you are of perhaps not just the misunderstanding, but the disdain of those who consider you ignorant, of those who consider you frivolous, of those who consider you misguided, of those who are willing to do without your presence and your relationship if this is the way you're going to go. I wonder if you're willing to risk coming up close to the light I wonder if you're willing to risk your employment, your reputation, your material possessions. I wonder if you're willing to risk your freedom. I wonder, in fact, what it is that you're willing to not risk. I wonder what it is in your life and in your mind and in your heart that you want to hold on to so much out of fear or desire that you, in fact, would just as soon forego this offer of life in order to hold on to or preserve what you have currently. What is it that keeps us from coming up close? What is it that keeps us from stepping into the light humbly? What is it that keeps us from being willing to open up our very most private parts of our lives, our spirit, our internal thinking, our doubts and fears? I wonder, what is it of all of that that keeps us from being willing to risk before the one who can give us true, rich life? Because fear is powerful. Because sin is shameful. And because there is something about us as people when we gather together that often demands conformity, that often demands agreement, that often demands likeness, that is often unwilling to accept differences simply because it's unfamiliar. I wonder, what is it in us today as a people that is holding us back because we're unwilling to risk giving Him full control? I wonder. And I invite you to take that wonder that perhaps you have and open it up and invite Him to step in. I invite you also this morning to turn to a story familiar to you. Particularly if you were with us last Sunday, or if you happened to watch last Sunday's sermon. I'm in John's Gospel this morning in chapter 9, where there is a story of a man who was born blind. I told you last Sunday it's a rich passage. It's so rich. There's so much in this passage. But I want to draw your attention this morning to the few verses that follow the part of the story we highlighted last Sunday. You see, this man born blind had been willing, even though he didn't initiate. The text doesn't tell us that he had anything at all to do with initiating the contact that he had with Jesus. He was willing to allow Jesus to touch him. He was willing to allow Jesus to come up close. And you might say, well, of course, Reed, the man was blind. Sure, he would let the healer come up and touch him. And I agree on the one hand, and yet I have to think to myself, yeah, I know. What are those things in me today that could really use Jesus' healing? I've just not quite reached the point of saying, here, Lord, put your hands on this part of my life. But he did. This man born blind, he allowed that to happen. And perhaps you remember the story. Perhaps you remember that Jesus not only healed him in his physical eyesight, but he healed his spiritual blindness as well. He enabled this man to see clearly the truth in the face of pretty strong opposition. And in an incredible interchange, one that just makes me laugh, and I recognize I probably don't have any right to laugh. I might be the one that is part of the villains here in some way if Jesus was up close and personal with me. But I have to laugh at this man's interchange. When they questioned him, determined, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, determined to squelch his witness, determined to alter his perception, determined to call out his sinfulness and his unworthiness, to challenge them. I just have to just giggle inside, frankly. That his eyes had been opened to such vision, to such a sight as the Lord, that not only did he take it, he threw it back to them with confidence. Right? You know the story? After trying to get him tripped up and not being successful a second time, chapter 9, verse 24 says, a second time they summoned the man who had been born blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. And let's face it, while you and I often know the truth, there's something inside us that tells us the truth of the Lord, the truth of what we've been taught, the truth of His Word, the truth of what we have experienced. The pressures around us sometimes can be profound. The pressures to succumb to the powers that be. The pressures that want to force us into conformity. The pressures that call on us to hold fast to what we have always believed because we were taught it by those authorities in our lives, those we respect, perhaps family, friends, co-workers, teachers. The pressure to hold on to that, even in the face of what we might think we've heard deep inside us that questions it, that challenges us to be willing to surrender even long-held beliefs. To allow the Lord of life to speak into our lives a truth we've not yet considered. This man being challenged again to this pretty substantial power, knowing that if he countered them, it was going to have real life ramifications, not just in the here and now, but in his life to come, the rest of his life in the community. His own parents had kind of left him on his own, if you will, to answer their persistent, challenging questions. And he says, whether or not he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered, I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? And he taunts them. Do you want to become his disciples too? And I laugh, and I love his audacity, and I love the strength of his conviction, and I love the vision that he's seen of truth, and I love the way the light has dispelled the darkness. But I marvel at what this text reveals that it doesn't outright say. Do you want to become his disciples? No, that's not the way it reads. How does it read? Do you want to become his disciples too? Already, he's made a commitment, not just to challenge their authority with his words, his bold audacity, but with his very life and the conviction that now determines every step forward. Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him. You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. Can you hear the pressure of those more educated and more experienced and more acceptable in life? Can you hear the voice of those who have power over your life and your family's life, challenging you in a public sphere? Come on, really? If the heat gets hot, are you willing to keep standing on this ridiculous new truth you apparently have? You don't even know where he comes from. Or perhaps his answer is, you don't know where he comes from? Yet he opened my eyes. And then this, and listen to this from one who's uneducated. Listen to this from one who is newly seeing. We know that God does not listen to sinners. In other words, you know he's a sinner, and yet he, and not you, have opened my eyes. He listens, God, that is. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Who's going to argue? Who's going to challenge him? Who's going to say, no, don't you remember when we did? It's easy, folks, to read this. It is for me. Maybe it is for you. It's easy for me to read this and say, well, sure, good grief, he's met the Lord. I mean, he can stand on that conviction, right? I mean, that's really easy to say. It's really easy to think and believe. It's a great story. And that's really easy to believe right up until the point that I'm found in the midst of people who don't see the way I see and don't believe the way I believe. And I'm not always talking about non-Christians. And the pressure is great to succumb to what fits our agenda. Because it's the way we've always been and what I've always been taught and what's comfortable to me. And what benefits me. And they challenge me to rethink or to hold up. And they question, do you really know that? Are you really going to commit to this way? Do you know what this may cost? Which is another way of saying, are you willing to risk? You were steeped in sin at birth. They insulted him. How dare you lecture us? And then one of the most profound statements in this man's life. And they threw him out. You ever been thrown out? You ever been thrown out? Because of something you did? Oftentimes I ask questions in here and I'm looking for people to really answer. That's a risky question to ask. You ever been thrown out? Because you might find out some people have done some things that they got thrown out that you don't want to know about. In all seriousness, you know what it feels like to be thrown out when you are obviously out of line with the prevailing thought and wisdom? In our age, in our country, in our place of living, with all the diversity and all the different views and all of the different challenges, you and I still have the privilege of living in a place where we could be thrown out, and while it may hurt a little bit, it may make me feel sad or rejected, I'll just go somewhere else. But what's this man going to do? He doesn't have the luxury of getting on a plane and flying to another place, or getting in a car and traveling to another place. Oh yeah, he could take off and walk with his new eyesight. But the man is being thrown out not just of that meeting. He's being thrown out of the synagogue. He's being thrown out of the local community. He's being thrown out of his support system. He's being thrown out at great consequence to him personally. Jesus heard, verse 35, that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, when Jesus found the man, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" That's an interesting thing to say from a compassionate Lord, isn't it? How about just a compassionate friend? It's kind of like saying, when you encounter someone who's just been thrown out or just been treated in such a way that they've lost all that was valuable to them, for a claim that they stood on, and instead of acknowledging what they've lost, you ask them to go a step farther, right? Not just acknowledging him as the one who healed you, not just as the one who stepped into your uncleanness and was willing to change you, but to then go a step farther and acknowledge you as the full and rightful authority of all humanity. The Son of Man, the one Daniel prophesied would be sent from God to redeem. Jesus doesn't enter in to comfort and console in this story, except to say, if you really want life, do you know who he is? Who is he, sir? The man answered. Tell me so that I may believe in him. I don't know how your translation reads. Some of them read differently, but the original languages here reveal that this particular reading is accurate, and there's a particular word that I want you to focus on. He said, "Tell me, sir." Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so I may believe in him. And when Jesus said, "You have now seen him, in fact, he is the one speaking with you," the man said, "Not, sir, I believe. Lord, I believe." There's no going back. There's nothing left for explanation. There's nothing left to be considered. There's not much left to be risked. He's pretty much laid it all out there. Lord, I believe. Lord, I have not only, but am willing to risk everything for you. And he worshiped him. Friends, you and I today are 2 weeks away from Easter. for true Christians, the holiest of all days. The most remarkable day. The day that commemorates the event without which you and I have nothing. Zip. The resurrection. Not resuscitation, the resurrection into a new life that has no end and is not subject to anything you and I struggle with. It is an authority and power without end, without limits and constraints. This is what happens when we celebrate Jesus' resurrection. We acknowledge. So the question I want to end with today is you reflect on this story. As you reflect on this man's willingness to risk everything he had. As you stop and consider, what are the pressures in my life that keep me in line? What are the ways that I've been formed in my thinking, the ways I've been brought up, the cultural influences, the rights and the wrongs, the loyalties or allegiances that I have? What of all of that is keeping me from being willing to say, if I believe you are the Son of the living God, the only begotten Son of the living God, the Lord who has redeemed my life, I believe. What is it in your practical day-to-day living that is keeping you from giving Him your full allegiance? I ask that question. Real question, not to be answered out loud to me, but for you to ask this week of yourself and of the Lord. What opinion, what viewpoint, what prejudice, what bias, what obstacle to full surrender still stands in the way in my life, in your life? And you can't answer so much about mine, or maybe you can. But I challenge you today. That's the question for you to consider this week. What is it in your life that you've not yet been willing to risk? What is it that you've not yet been willing to hand over to Him to say, is this what you know is true? Is this what you want me to believe? Is this what you want me to continue to act on? Or does this need to change? Do I need to see in a way I haven't been able to see before? So that's the first question to ask. Specifically, Lord, I know this is in me. I know I hold on to it deeply. If I give it to you, what will happen? Here's the second question I want you to consider and ask yourself. If left unanswered, if you don't in fact ask this question to yourself and before the Lord, and you continue to live in this way with this thought, opinion, conviction, prejudice, bias, whatever, and you were to meet Him sooner than expected, what answer would you give as to why you didn't release it? Now, this is obviously for Christians. This is not a question for those that are exploring or unbelievers. This is a question for those of us who are believers. What is it that we're not yet willing to hand over? Because if you pray the prayer that I'm praying and I've challenged you to pray, give me the eyes of Christ and the mind of Christ and the heart of Christ so that I'll live as the hands and feet of Christ, then there can't be anything that stands in the way. There can't be any... There can't be anything I'm unwilling to surrender. Lord, help us today to be willing to surrender. Anything at all. And everything that may hinder me from living the resurrection life you offer.